special evening, I will call upon to make the intro Mr. John Legg. John?
Ladies and gentlemen, you probably know Charles Scot-Brown came back after the war, having commanded B Company of 1 Gordon in Europe. Temporary major. Charles came back and joined the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry out west. Tonight we have the commander of 2 Brigade, the Canadian Army from Petawawa, who happens to be the late Colonel Rutherford's favorite nephew. And Jason Adair, Colonel Adair, I can't say that, he's the brigadier, has something for Charles. And in a former life before he became a senior officer, he too was a Patricia. Sir?
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
I've got to tell you, the last time I was here, I was about 17. And I used to go into the basement, and they allowed smoking then. And you had a cigar in your mouth. So I've known you for 20 years. And imagine, as a young man who wanted to join the military, being surrounded by men like this. And in that basement bar, there were guys like, and I can't even call him Charles, I'm going to call you Sir, and Tom Gilday, and Ken Bell, and Uncle Bob, as I knew him. And he'd bring me over. And he'd say, come for lunch to Toronto. And as a 17-year-old kid with a bad knot in my tie, I'd come down University Avenue, I'd figure out where to park in my old Toyota Corolla, and I'd come into the basement and I'd see guys like Charles, Scot-Brown, and Tom Gilday. So time goes on, I went to university, became an officer in the Patricias. And Charles kept tracking. What are you up to? What are you up to? And I went to Afghanistan, and it was a time when, early days, 2002, where you never got any email. And if you did, it was very episodic. And I'll never forget it. So there I am in Afghanistan as a platoon commander, lieutenant, and out pops an email just after Tarnak Farms when we got bombed from Charles Scot-Brown. Now, talk about putting things into perspective. We thought that was a pretty bad thing, and it was. But when we start putting things in perspective, this man right here could put things into perspective. So I appreciated it then, and I appreciate it now. So, sir, on behalf of the current serving, and I'm not only just a Patricia, but I'm a soldier like you. And you've taught me, you showed us what right looked like. So this isn't from me to you necessarily, this is from us to you. Because we don't forget where we came from, nor where we are. So from me to you, I want to give you this. And if you don't mind, I'll give you one more thing and you'll appreciate it after I do it. But I want to give you this first. Okay. Noah, come up. He's like, what am I doing right now? Noah, come up here. So Noah, I don't know Noah. I don't know Noah at all. But I was Noah 20 years ago. So Noah, it's important you don't forget nights like this, because they don't come around often. And I'm going to give you this, and you can do with it what you want, but just remember nights like this matter, because they're not going to happen forever. So I want to give you that. I'm passing the torch, Noah. Yeah.
Well done. Well done, young guy. You do it. You do it.
You're on.
Thank you.
You're on.
And ladies and gentlemen, I've got one small thing to say before I start talking the war deals, and that is, since World War II, every time when the males get into problems, and our hockey team isn't doing too well, and our soccer team isn't doing too well, what we do now is we send over the girls and let them clean their flippin' clock. With the result that I notice all the ladies are smiling, and so you should, ladies, and God bless all of you. And to show all of us here in this room have had one moment in our life which is important to us. And I am a very fortunate old guy because I've got a very attractive, lovely young lady that looks after me and keeps me on the straight and level. And and it has to be a Celt, and it has to be a Welsh. And her name has to be Jones, which it all is. And Louise does many different things as a volunteer. And one of the things she does is work with a unit called Outreach. And these are the people that go down to the Tenderloin in Toronto and look after the drug addicts and the people that have fallen by the wayside and usually wind up with drug overdoses. Last weekend, a lady came up to her and said, "We got a problem with a man over here, and we think he's got an overdose. Can you help us?" And Louise grabbed her bag, and fortunately it had the necessary kit in it, which they told her she should have in it. And she went to that person and started to give the person CPR. That didn't work. She reached in and used her necessary injections, needle injections, 4 times. All the time doing CPR. Tonight, Louise has got pains on pains, because you can imagine how painful it is. She told the lady that was there, "Phone 911, get the paramedics, get the people here as fast as possible." They did. And when the paramedics came, when she was doing this, the person started to breathe again. And Louise passed that big time, which all of us did. She saved her first life. And if anyone deserves a Bravo Zulu, if anyone serves a Bravo Zulu, which is a naval term for well done, Louise, God bless you, dear Bravo Zulu, and I hope you don't have to do too many more. And we're very proud of you. I came from a military family. I was very fortunate. Like Louise, I'm also a Celt, but I'm on the jock side and she's on the taffy side. But we didn't have any Paddies in our family, either one of us. And she can sing like a bird the way most Welsh people can. My grandfather was a doctor. In those days, they were called surgeons. And in those days, the doctors were the same as padres. They didn't wear rank. They wore officer uniforms with no badges of rank. And they were equal to the person they were talking to. If they were talking to the company sergeant major, they were equal to the company sergeant major. If they were talking to the brigadier, they were equal to him or the general. My grandfather commanded a hospital in South Africa and did very, very well. When he came back, World War I came along, and he decided to come in again. And he read into Freud and some other things, being a Scot which was used to free education, and he liked that. The Scots like anything that has the word free in it. And the Taffies aren't much behind us either, let's say. And he said that soldiers get tired and they get weary. And they get nervous because they've seen too much. But if you take them and put them in a quiet environment and give them rest, the brain will rejuvenate itself and they will be ready to serve again. My grandfather was given 2 wards in Leeds Hospital in central England, and at the end of the war he had half the hospital. It was the first psychiatric hospital. And one of the people which he had to look after was my father, who after Vimy Ridge was down in the deep dugout one night and they got a direct shot on it, and that was the second time my father survived by being buried alive twice. Now I think I had a barrack box full of wound stripes, but let me tell you, being buried alive would really put the wind up my pipe too. And I think every one of you sitting in this room, because I noticed quite a few of you when I said he was buried alive twice. My father was sent out to Lord Thurlow's establishment in Scotland, and he sat up in the Highlands for about 2 months, just in time to join the Canadians and Vimy Ridge. So talk about out of the frying pan into the fire, guess what? So I still wear for my father the Vimy. He went to the first one, I went to the second one. And I will remember. When World War II came along, there was no doubt about it that I was going to join the forces. But I was worried about it. It was 39, and I was born in 23, so I was only 16. And I was over at Jarvis Collegiate and spending too much time on the sports field and not enough time in the classroom, and suddenly decided that if I wanted to get out of this establishment and get into the Army, I better start studying, so I did. And I skipped a grade, and I had my senior matric at 17. And immediately went down to Armory Street over here and joined the forces, the 48th Highlanders. I was a cadet in their cadet corps, and I was a stretcher bearer with the medical company. Because in those days I was playing in the drums, and there was 3 of us: Jim Finley, Mac Murdoch, and myself. Jim Finley had B75411, Mac Murdoch had B75412, and I had B75413. And people say, how do you remember your regimental number? It's easy. No problem at all. Now, but my trouble was, I was going to go to RMC, but when RMC heard that I was coming, they immediately closed it and turned it into a staff college, because they said, we can't take this monster, holy jeez. So I was back in the group. I started off because I was too young to be in to start off with. You were supposed to be 18. I was 17 and a half, because I was born in the second half of the year. In August, I'll be 96. And that shows you that clean living and true sportsmanship always wins through. But what is the secret in being a good soldier? What is the secret of being a good officer? What is the secret of being a good rifleman? Very simple. Join the infantry, keep your eyes open and your mouth shut, and you're bound to be a success. And you always get the last word in, yes, sir. Which will also help you in your marriage for the rest of your life, where you say yes, dear. I was fortunate enough that I passed my officer selection and appraisal board, which was on Trois-Rivières, because I had the horrible fact of life. My father, after World War I, was allowed as an engineer to go and work in the industry for a short while, post-war. And in 1923, he was with the International Pulp and Paper Company in a place called Temiskaming, Quebec. And our house was 300 yards from the dam at the bottom of Lake Temiskaming, which is the beginning of the Ottawa River. So as I used to tell the Vandus, I'm 30 yards, because of 30 yards, I'm a frog too. And you can imagine when I joined the Patricias and I would start to speak my French, and we'd get the Vandus going and we'd start to tease them. And I think our regiment is fairly familiar and fairly well known as a teasing regiment, because we do it amongst ourselves. And we tease everybody. And the fun which we had in those days, everybody had a nickname. And you got a nickname because you were good. Now, they want to send you to jail. It's very confusing for an old fellow like me, and that's why I need a young lady as beautiful as Louise to look after me. But I promise you, you won't have to use any of your needles on me. Tried it once and didn't like it. The biggest thing you can do is take one look at your soldiers and you can't help but be proud of them. They don't ask for much, and they give everything. So I made it a vow as a young man, and I was now a very dangerous second lieutenant at 18, waiting to go to A-10 Camp Borden to get my second PIP, which I did in 30 days. And then I was ready to get into the draft company and go overseas. But unfortunately at that time, in the late 42, 43, they closed down two of the home divisions in the Atlantic side of Canada. The soldiers were draftees, the NCOs, warrant officers, were volunteers, and the soldiers got the draftees got the nickname of zombies. But in fairness to them, they said, we will do whatever our politicians tell us to do. If they call us into the armed forces, as one of my older soldiers, he was 32, by this time I'm 18, and I'm pretty serious, let me tell you. I was told to grow a mustache, so I did, to look older. And this guy said, I am married. We had to ask them if they wanted to volunteer to go overseas. And this guy said, no. And I said, why not? He said, I'm married, I have 2 kids. And he said, is it fair for me to go overseas and possibly get killed, and my wife has to bring those 2 lovely kids up? But if my country tells me to go, I will go. And I felt sorry for the guy, and I said, you know what? I agree with you. So I went and saw the padre, and I said, can we get this guy out quicker? Which we did. I learned from my father, you look after your soldiers, no matter what you do. I did my first patrol at 5 years old. And when we were stationed, he was the assistant engineer officer in Montreal headquarters. Although he was a machine gunner in World War I. The machine gunners in World War I were the equivalent of the paras and the commandos of World War II. The machine gun was the killer of World War I. That was the casualty area. And if you think a machine gun, and there's one very beautiful one in the sports bar, take a look at it. And once you hear that fire, and it goes vecka, 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 that's the first thing you learn as an infantry before you go into battle. It's called the crack and thump. And I see some of the infanteers smiling because they've gone and listened to it and been on the range and had the rounds shot over their head and over their rear ends when they were crawling on the assault courses. That's the best training you can get, because that saves your bacon the first time they take a crack at you, because you're down where you should be. Getting ready for this, there was literally platoons of officers in Camp Borden. Literally, physically, platoons of them. In those days, we lived out of steamer trunks. All officers had a steamer trunk. That's the ones that open up and the two tops open, and they were the ones that you used to, when you crossed the Atlantic, you had a steamer trunk, and then you had a second group of clothes which you took with you, which went into your cabin so that you could, usually a black tie, a wedding and wake suit, and a sports jacket. So we lived out of those. We used double-decker beds, but only one officer to the double-decker, so the top one became your clothes closet. And all of a sudden, they came in and they said, there's a scheme out now looking for officers, infantry officers, to join the British Army for battle experience. Are any of you interested? 100% put their hand up. Get out of Camp Borden. The reinforcement officers talk about discrimination today. The reinforcement officers were considered the crazy ones going overseas amongst the home establishment ones. They were usually World War I guys that were the company commanders, etc. So we decided that we'd fight very quietly, fight with fight. So we made some signs, and at the head table at the top where the colonel and all his top echelon officers sat for their meals, we put home defense. And on all the tables down in the book, we put on active service. So they called us in and they said, and this was again a mistake, we wanted to get overseas. So they said, the more pranks we played, they'd say, we're going to teach you something. We're going to put you on draft and send you overseas, and then you won't get into any trouble. That's almost a Trumpism. We had 639 Canloan officers volunteer to go to the British Army. That number were the ones that were selected to go down in Sussex, New Brunswick to Canloan. We had about 700 and some, but some of them were sick, some of them were old, and they couldn't make it. We did an officer assessment like anything else. When you get a new group of soldiers and you want to find out what you've got, the company sergeant major, you look at them and say, Sergeant Major, tease all the troops, and let's see what kind of stuff we got in this company. And that's what you do. You find out what's there. And it only takes you a day. And how you do it is exactly the same way as the DS solution was on the officer selection circuits they used to put us through in the early days. And the first stage that they did was you came to a place where there was a folded marquee tent, and there was a corporal and 10 men there. And the officer looked at you and he said, you are the officer in charge of this group. You've got 10 minutes to get that tent up. Start. And the DS solution is very simple. You turn around and you say, Corporal, you got 8 minutes to get that tent up. He's put up 40 of them with the men, and I'll be back in 8 minutes to inspect it to make sure it's fine. If you said that, which I did because I was tipped off by an old buddy, and you win first prize. And you learn your first lesson before you get commissioned. Don't do another guy's job, or don't tell him how to suck eggs. Tell him what you want, clear, concise, and kiss. Keep it simple, stupid, and you'll be the best officer in the battalion. I guarantee you. And everyone's smiling, because everyone's doing the job they're paid for, doing the job they're trained for, and that's how you win it. It's simple. And the joke in the Gordons used to be, stick your head up, Corporal, and see how the men are. Hard on corporals, great on lieutenants. But that was the in joke. And everything, when you're in that position where you're making decisions that can affect other people, listen to what they say. Give them a chance. If you ever saw any confused soldiers, were the English soldiers or the Scottish soldiers, the Celt soldiers, when Canlone came in. They'd never seen an officer go down. They'd never seen an officer walk around and talk with them. Definitely not dull old chap. But we did, because that's how you find out what you've got in there, in that platoon, where your strengths are. Who is the strong one? Who is the guy that's good at this? And within an infantry battalion, during World War II, was roughly 1,100 men. Now I think they're down to about 800, aren't they, or 650? In that area, am I in the ballpark, guys? Yeah. But we've got a gun that fires 15 times faster. And you've also got, the better the gun and the faster the rounds of ammunition, the less men you need. So what you're doing is you're taking the targets out and making it that much harder for casualties, because you don't need extra people. And one of the old expressions always used to be, when somebody would try something and then over-establish, we used to say, fly killed with elephant gun. That's a deep one. So with this as a background, Normandy was coming around. That's why we were there. Out of the 623 officers that actually went to the British Army, we had 129 killed and 85% casualties. 2 wound stripes was considered average in the Canlones. Because our grandfathers and great-grandfathers did such good jobs in South Africa and World War I, they figured we were all Red Indians and we loved to go out and fight in the woods. But we commanded no man's land, and that is what you have to do. Normandy was the toughest fighting that we had. But the soldiers that the Germans used were normally slave soldiers, and they came from the steppes. They were Polish and Ukrainian, most of them. And they had, their divisional numbers had very big numbers. And my first wound was caused in a place called Colombelle. And Colombelle was the factory area of Caen. And it had two huge chimneys for the smoke to be out. And the Germans, God bless them, are not stupid. They got the moxie and they took one look at those two and the chimneys and said, beautiful OPs and safe as hell. We tried everything in the world to get rid of those two cotton-picking chimneys because they were commanding a direct look over our MSR, main supply route, to 51st Highland Division and 6th Airborne Division, which were on the west side of the Orne River. Normandy doesn't go north and south, it goes east and west. And believe me, that took us a day or two to get used to, too. I patrolled Colombelle for 6 nights, finding out what was there, because we tried everything. The Navy tried it. They had their warships, the biggest ones they had, and they were firing these great, big, huge rounds, which were interesting as hell. They'd go shoom, 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 and then the whole earth would shake and then it'd go whoomph. But as soon as any of that ammunition or any of the bombs hit those chimneys, by virtue of being round and solid, they just ricocheted off. The last time I was in Caen, those cotton picking things are still there. Because for our battle for Colombelle, B Company and D Company were the two lead companies. My platoon, I was dropping off a section at the chateau, which happened to be the commanding office building for 21st Panzer when they were there. But they pulled out, and then they put, our 385 Division pulled out, and 21st Panzer came in the night that they came in at 10 o'clock at night. We crossed the start line at midnight. And they cleaned our flippin' clock. I was wounded. I stepped on an S-mine. The corporal and 10 men I sent off to the chateau, we found 4 of them at the end of the war as POWs. I found out and went and saw them up in Aberdeen when they came back. I was evacuated out, and the 1st Gordons walked out with 5 officers and 232 men. Not good. But yet, when I look at it today, I say, we did pretty good. Because when 3rd Canadian Division took Colombelle, the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders got the chateau that I sent a corporal and 10 men to. Now that's pretty good, tough, hard men. And they did actually chase the Germans out of it. But the Germans, the 21st Panzer immediately came in right behind and they solid it. Normandy was the toughest fighting that we had in French Germany. And it was difficult, to say the least. On D-Day, when we landed, we were the second wave. We were 153 Brigade of 51st Highland Division, and we went in with 3rd British and behind them, and we took out the 2 radar stations. Our company took out, or B Company, took out the one in Oosterham, and we were in our forming up point, ready to do the attack on the radar station, and D Company was doing the 2nd radar station, and we crossed the start line going in at 1600 hours, 4 o'clock in the afternoon of D-Day. That night, at 19, I wrote my first letters home. And my grandfather had insisted, if you command a platoon, every man that is hurt, wounded, or killed, you write the next of kin. To this day, I still hate writing letters. There's many times when you have to cross your fingers when you write that letter, because the guy probably may not have been going in the right direction, and you have to give him the better of the doubt, and you don't want to embarrass his family. And I think even the Padre wouldn't give you any Hail Marys if you told him the truth. So ever since, when I see Trump, I sort of sympathize with him when the way he talks sometimes about how he gets his figures and facts, because I've done it in letters. Every soldier went well. Every soldier did his job for their families. And I'd pass it on to the infanteers in this room. If you ever have to do it, look at the good side of the man, forget the bad ones. You just don't tell the whole story. The other thing is, when you're commanding soldiers, you command them, no one else. If somebody has a complaint about your men, make sure they understand that they come to you, because you're my men. I signed for them. 38 live bodies. The other corps had exactly the same problems, exactly the same deals. Because in military, you don't own a piece of real estate until you've got a soldier with a $68 rifle standing on that piece of ground. You don't own it until you get that guy on. And everybody else in the forces is there to assist him to get there. It takes 46 men to put one infantry soldier in the front line fighting. In World War II, we got $1.50 a day. Walking around money. A lieutenant got $5. That was $35 a week. That was considered a good job in those days. You could get an apartment for $37.50 a month with 2 bedrooms. I know, because when my father was killed, Mother sold our house and got an apartment because I was gone and I was an only child. So everything is relevant. But is it? They don't ask for much. A hot meal, a bottle of beer, some smokes. And they did those chores. The young soldier today is equally as good. And in every infantry battalion, there isn't anything that you can't solve or find an answer from one of those men in those 600. And I'll tell you a story, and I know the RCR are going to stand up and throw stones at me, but God bless you, I don't blame you. But this was one of my Polacks by the name of Jurkowski. The ski, they're always Polish, and the ASs and everything else are Ukrainian, and they're called hunkies. And the Ukrainians used to stand up and say, strong like bull, face like monkey, must be hunky, chikai chikai, dobra dobra. And the only one that understands it is Chris back there, which means good, good. But everybody had a nickname, and everybody had a joke, and everybody was teased. And that lasted until Korea. And no one took shots at each other more than the PPCLI and the Van Doos, at least in the RCR. The Van Doos were there. They were excess baggage. We were both expected to carry them. And we still do. Because I'm 30 yards away inside, and I'm a fog, so I can say it. And I can bring out my Quebec blue birth certificate and say, what's up, mon Dieu, Collis? In Normandy, I had to take a patrol out. And the operations officer said, the QM will be bringing up a folding assault craft for you, and you can take your 8 men in that and then just leave it on the bank and go. And I said, you gotta be flippin' kidding. He said, what do you mean? I said, I don't want that bloody boat. I said, if I take that boat and leave it at the side of the river, every boxhead that walks by that river is going to say, aha, English and sock, Nick. Hey? And they're standing waiting for me. They said, what are you going to do? I said, leave it with me. So I went around and I walked up to the first Frenchman I saw. And I said, bonsoir, monsieur. And he said, bonsoir. I said, avez-vous un chaloupe? He said, un chaloupe, qu'est-ce que ça? A chaloupe, what is that? I said, un chaloupe, un bateau avec l'eau, a boat with rows. Ah oui, j'avais un. And he gives it to me and says, good. I gave him a package of cigarettes and I say, I'll bring it back in 2 days. Giving myself lots of time. I took my 3 men and did my reconnaissance patrol. The boat was still there because the guy said, where will we hide it, sir? I said, just leave the thing right out in the open. It's a French boat. It joins in with the scene. Came back from the patrol. There's our boat, in, back. And they looked at me and said, where did you find that out? I said, in a place called Temiskaming, Quebec. I said, it's a very old French-Canadian town. It was brand new. So the Gordons automatically thought that I was first cousin of an Indian. But that's the Canadian way. When you train your soldiers, you never destroy their individuality, because that in them is what will bring you through every time. There's one guy in that mob that can give you the DS solution for any problem you had. And earlier I said I was going to tell you one. We were up in Whitehorse in 1946, and we had driven from Calgary to Whitehorse in World War II vehicles. And that winter was a meanie. It was colder than a hooker's kiss, believe me. It was horrible. There was nothing like it. And sitting in the back of those flippin' vehicles with crazy coats. We didn't have winter coats or winter kit or anything. And when we came back, Cammy Ware looked at us and he said, "How in the hell did you ever do it?" We said, "Grudgingly." But our trouble was that there was no warm garages in Whitehorse to store our vehicles. With the result, every night they froze. Well, we did the normal thing that they do out in the farm. You take the battery out of the car or the truck and you put it by the fire, because the fire goes all night in the house. And that battery is hot. You put it in the morning and usually it'll kick it over. But up there it was so cold and the grease, the oil, was so thick it was almost like grease. And it didn't have the power to kick it. So we used to have pushers. And of course you always had a frozen thing, so you'd hear a Jeep going by going thump, 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 with this flat piece. That's when you got them started. So Jurkowski comes up and he says, "You know," he said, "when we lived in northern Saskatchewan, it gets pretty cold up there too in the winter." And I looked at him and I said, "You want to believe it?" He said, "We didn't have that problem." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well," he said, "in the wintertime, Dad used to go into the kitchen, take a tomato can, and he'd put in Varsol into the oil deal and mix it around and let it purr around, and that stayed in there all winter, and you put the battery in and it started every time." I said, "Come here, jerk." That was his nickname. Everybody has a nickname in the Patricias and the RCR. I said, "Come here." Took him over to the kitchen. I said, "What size of a tomato can?" So then I say, "Hey, if we're going to play around with these vehicles, we better get Remy to do it, to give us the okay. Either that or with misuse of D&D equipment." So I got a hold of the Remy officer in the garages up in Whitehorse, and I said, "We want to try something." He said, "What's that?" So I told him about it. He said, "You know what? I'm a chemical engineer. I think that would work." I said, he said it was Varsol. He said, "Yeah," he said, "it should work. It should cut the oil, but it shouldn't deteriorate it too much, and it will stand up to the friction, which is what it's there for." It worked. Ever hear of Winter 40?
WD-40.
WD-40? WD-30? So I got a hold of Shell, who had the POL, petrol, oil, and lubricant sales for the Patricias, and said, "This is what this guy of ours has said," and it worked like a charm, because we drove 6 vehicles. We took 2 of each type of vehicle, which we had up there. We had 3 types: Jeep 1500 weight and 6000 weight. And when it came back to Calgary, they immediately pulled the heads off them, and it just shone like this, like the thing. So I went to Shell and I said, "This soldier of mine should have some kind of recognition from you people, even if it's only an article in the paper or something like that." And they said, "No, should be money." I said, "Well, he's a Polak." I said, "Geez, you better be careful." I said, "Because if I tell him you're going to give him money and you don't give him money, I'll be dead." He said, "If we say we're going to give you money, he'll get the money." I said, "Okay." So I went and told Jerk. I said, "Jerk, you might get some money for this." He said, "Holy Jesus, sir." He said, "What'll I do with it?" I said, "You're going to put it in the flipping bank. You're not going to put it in the wet canteen, you big Polak." And he said, "Okay, boss." He said, "I'll do it." So he gave me permission to do it. And he got, in those days, $5,500. When his pay was $1.50 a day. But that's what you do. And that's how you treat your men. And that's how you look after your men. And needless to say, that check went from his hands after he signed it directly to the bank manager. And Dirk, by the time he was ready to get married, he didn't have to worry about the money tree at the wedding. He already had the down payment for his farm in Saskatchewan. That is a bit of a touch on what war is and what war is like. But the one thing is that I said, if you remember early, that the people, the soldiers win the battle, but the country wins the war. And there was a bigger battle going on right here in Toronto and right here in Canada. And it was, where do you get the people to work the factories when the men are all gone? And that's when the girls came forward. And ever since, they were so successful, and when we came back from overseas, the Army would send us out to Ingus, to Massey Harris, to all these factories that made the Bren guns, the Sten guns, the pistols, and we went out and thanked them for doing such a great job, and the ammunition always worked, and told them what a great job they did, and they were absolutely thrilled about it. But they were the ones that saved our bacon. The same way as today, every time the men's team can't work, we'll send over the girls and they'll clean their clock. Have a good one, everybody. Cheers. Are there any questions? No questions? Nobody needs a loan or anything? Don't pay cash, I can get it for you wholesale. Yes, sir.
How does the can loan program end up? Did you finish the war with the 40s, or did you return to Canadian?
Well, I did a bit of a, I always do a bit of a deal. When I was wounded, when I stepped on the S-mine, I got a blighty, so I went back to England. And we had a big new thing. We had that great new solve-it-all penicillin. And penicillin looked like molasses, and it was dark and black and thick, and the needles were about the size of a darning needle or a knitting needle. And they had nurses that worked, and you got this shot in your muscular rear end was the best place, every 3 hours. And the nurses would, if you were sleeping at night, they'd cross your legs, pull down the blankets, cross your legs, flip you over, pull down your pajama strides, throw the needle like a dart in your rear end, squeeze it, and it stung. Oh, geez, did it sting. And you could tell every bed in every hospital ward there was a penicillin bed because the springs were all down like that. You'd figure that Amos and Andy had a threepenny upright in those beds. And you just couldn't do it. So I went down to London District Assembly Centre, and they said, a sign there, any officer interested in taking a parachute course, please see the adjutant. So I knocked on the adjutant's door, and I heard the word enter, and there was a guards officer with his hat off, and he had a big bird cage around his head with a couple of screws in his head, holding it up. He'd been shot in the neck, and he was surveying, he was acting as the adjutant. He said, what do you want, Canada? He said, you're one of those can loan officers, are you? And I said, yeah. He said, who are you with? I said, 51st Highland Division. He said, good division. I said, yeah, they like Canadians well. He said, how do you know? I said, because I never stayed with them. I was always out in the field. He said, that's what we like about you guys. He said, you can't get you down. And that's the secret of anything you do. Don't let it get you down. Don't let it get you down. Keep smiling. So we had, I went and I took a 2-week course, what they called a flash course. That was for officers that had been wounded, had been blooded, and you were accepted on your war record, your fighting record. Fortunately, mine was fairly decent. And they gave me the course, and then I showed up at 1 para, and I did the Arnhem drop. And I wasn't very pleased about that. Arnhem, if pre-war in the Dutch Army, if you did the attack the way we did in World War II, you would have failed the course. Plus, they chose the wrong divisions to get to us. The English soldiers all have their strengths. Your best attackers are your Celts, because they're used to running up around the hill and all that kind of stuff, and they're movers. The English are the quiet, subtle ones. So if you want to defend something, you put an Englishman there. You put an Englishman there, but make sure you to come back and tell him when he can come out, or else 20 years later he'll still be there. And he will be. No one moves him. No one is more stubborn, God bless you dear, than a good Englishman. And they are. The Scotsmen, if you want to take a piece of ground, do. So what did they do for the units to try and get to us? When 30 Corps, they chose the Guards Armored Division, lovely guys, beautiful soldiers, gorgeous uniforms, but you had tea 3 times a day. And it's frightfully unbecoming an officer and gentleman to fight in the afternoon. And we're getting the hammered out of us in Arnhem. It was the biggest game of cowboys and Indians I've ever played. And let me tell you, the Germans, they were the guys that got out of Falaise. And they were being re-tanked and resupplied. And those guys were good. And they hammered us. Because we didn't have the heavy weapons. We didn't have our Vickers. We finally got some in on day 3. But the Vickers were basically in the gliders. They had them. The KOSBs, the South Staffs, and the Border Regiment, they went in with gliders, and they stayed around divisional headquarters and made that secure, which was only fair and only right. I don't question the tactics of the paras that were there. We were asked to hold it 3 days. We held it 9. And that's when Halton said, it's 4 o'clock, tea time in Arnhem, but there is no tea. And there wasn't. And for a humor end, I walked into a Dutch house, and the guy said, how are things going? He spoke good English. I said, I wish I knew. He said, what do you mean? I said, our radios don't work. He said, what do you mean? I said, the radios don't work. He said, what did you do with them? I said, we threw them in the flippin' Rhine. We got rid of them. We didn't want the Germans to get them, so we threw them in the River Rhine because they were 38 pounds. They didn't take the units that made 1st Airborne Division came from the Middle East. They didn't take a piece of the radio that worked in the Middle East. I'm having a senior's moment and the word won't come to me. The crystal. They didn't change the crystals, so we had ones that would work damn well in Cairo, but wouldn't work with us. So I said, I wish I knew what the hell was going on. He said, would you like to speak to divisional headquarters? I said, I'd love to. He said, just a minute, I'll get my phone. And he picked up the phone, and he phoned and asked for the chateau that they were staying in. And all of a sudden, G3 came along, who happened to be a Gordon, and he knew me. And he said, Thompson here. I said, Tommy, it's Charles. He said, where in the hell are you? He said, I thought you were with 1st Battalion. I said, I was. He said, what's doing? I said, I wish the hell I knew. I said, the radios don't work. He said, yes, we've got the wrong crystals in them. The name came. They got the wrong crystals in them. I said, oh. He said, well, I'll tell you what, Charles. Every time you go from one house to the other, phone us and tell us and let us know what you're talking about. I said, I can't do it. He said, why not? I said, I haven't got any pennies with me. I won't say what he said, but it wasn't very polite. It wound up with off. That was Arnhem.
Sir, how did you get out of Arnhem?
I swam the River Rhine, and my batman had been wounded through the shoulder, through and through. So I told him to grab around my neck, and I took him with me. And when we got to the far side, the River Rhine isn't that wide, but it's very fast and cold. Oh, God, it was cold. And I could hear this language and voice going on, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And I put my head in the water and shook it again. And I said, I'm not going to say Canadian because I was with the British, 1st Airborne, outside of 1st Battalion and 5th Battalion, which were Scottish battalions of Paris. And I said, so I shook my head and I said, Anglican, Anglican. And the most beautiful words I ever heard in all my life. Polski, Polski. The Polish paratroopers had landed the day before. The only time in my life I ever wanted to kiss a Pole. I'm standing there, freezing cold, in my gouchies, and he gave me his blanket, his burial blanket. I took it off his small pack, and I wrapped that around me, and my batman got one of the other Poles, and they took us back to their battalion headquarters, and then they put us in a vehicle and sent us to Eindhoven, and we stayed in Eindhoven, and I got a little bit fed up with that, so I picked up the phone and I said, give me HD 61, please, rear div. And all of a sudden the voice came up, Lindsay here, who was the QM. I said, Jimmy, it's Charles. He said, where in the hell are you? I said, I'm in Eindhoven. He said, what are you doing there? I said, I've just come out of Arnhem. He said, what in the hell were you doing there? You're supposed to come back here. I said, well, they just gave me a new set of gouchies and all that good stuff, and I said, I got new clothes, but they got all funny patches on them. He said, well, don't worry about that. He said, I got your kit from Normandy. I said, you didn't send it back to Aldershot? He said, no, I knew you'd come back. So I said, how about the Colt 455 that I left in my bedroll? He said, somehow it got lost. He was a gun collector. He said, somehow it got lost, but there's a Luger in change of it. So I came back and I had my Luger again, so it's there. And I brought that back and gave it to the OPP after the war when I came here. Yes, sir.
Charles, could you tell us about your sergeant at Arnhem? Who were your NCOs?
Say again?
Who were your NCOs at Normandy and at Arnhem?
Oh, the NCOs were the greatest guys in the world. And funny. And funny. I guess the funniest one of all of them, they could never understand what I was doing and what we were thinking of. Before we went into, well, I'll switch. In Normandy, we had been about 3 weeks on compo boxes. And as any infantry would tell you, when you go on field rations and you go on IFRs, 3 weeks is a hell of a long time to be on those suckers because you get the same thing day after day after day. And mind you, with a bit of cunningness and stealth in the compo boxes, which was a section, 14 man's rations for 1 day. They gave you 8 cigarettes, 16 sheets of toilet paper. If you needed 17, thumb and finger. And And everything was in these boxes that you needed. And the good ones, what you do is, in the Gordons, we'd sneak over to the 5th Black Watch and we'd take out the H packs and give them the A and Bs, because they had Spam for the Americans, god-awful stuff. And we would pick up the F ones, which were meat and veg. So we didn't steal their rations, we just switched them, because they liked it better. But you play games on each other. Answer your question, I hope. I skirted it a bit. I've been watching CTV too much for what's going on in Ottawa right now. Anything else? God bless you all. Thank you ever so much for coming. And one thing, and I'd be a great amiss, and I wouldn't be living up to my reputation if I didn't ask all you people to please give a real hand to the Royal Canadian Regiment, Guy Lombardo's own, and they're the best 2nd Battalion in the world. God bless you.